On behalf of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, I want to welcome you to this two-part presentation on colonial American architecture. I'm Calder Loth, an architectural historian who for many years worked for Virginia's Historic Preservation Office. Consequently, a number of the images I will show are of Virginia properties, many of which I have dealt with either directly or indirectly. But I will compare and contrast them with images of buildings and details elsewhere in America, and also England. Now, this presentation does not include an examination of colonial brickwork. That subject is thoroughly covered in my class on historic brickwork, the video of which is available on the ICAA website, or you can access it online. Just search ICAA Historic Brickwork. So let's begin with a typical 20th century colonial revival residence that could exist most anywhere in this country. Despite its American flag, anyone looking at this picture would instinctively conclude that this is an American house. Well, let's look at a grander, more formal colonial revival work. This too has a distinctly American flavor. And another, a more generic house type. Most of us would identify this as a normal-looking home. If you asked a child to draw a picture of a house, it probably would look something like this. And finally, a modern dentist's office. Well, no one enjoys going to the dentist, but such a homey-looking dentist's office as this could likely offer a calming effect, especially for a child. So where does the look of these buildings come from? Why do they look the way they do? Well, as we probably assume, they are inspired by the dwellings of our colonial past. Typical is the 1760 Dudley Diggs House in Yorktown, Virginia, a classic example of colonial American architecture. Now, by colonial, I'm defining it as the period extending from 1607 until 1781, when we rid ourselves of our last vestige of British authority with the American victory at Yorktown. But we can stretch it a few years. Now, this house was built by Englishmen for an Englishman, but it would be difficult to find houses that looked like this in England. Why? To answer, we have to back up a couple of centuries to Tudor England. We're looking at an impressive Tudor manor house, Little Morton Hall. Well, what is the most conspicuous aspect of this house? Obviously, we see a lavish display of timber construction. But we need to realize that England was running short of good quality timber in the Tudor period. The great forests were being cleared for pasture as well as for construction material and shipbuilding. Only a rich man could afford a large and elaborately crafted timber structure as this. So this is an example of conspicuous consumption. The owner is showing off. Well, what did the settlers find when they first arrived here on these shores? Well, endless virgin forests. You would think that with such an endless supply of wood, the first colonists would build structures more elaborate than ever. But buildings like this require two things the earliest colonists didn't have: skilled builders and time. The first colonists arrived in a land essentially devoid of buildings. They needed to put up simple basic shelter as quickly as possible. We know from archaeology that some of the earliest colonial structures were crude in the extreme. Simply a hole in the ground with a roof over it, called pit houses. Virginia's Jamestown settlement is an outdoor museum using conjectural reconstructions to exhibit living conditions in Jamestown in the first decades of settlement. Following English precedents, these dwellings have simple exposed frames infilled with noggin of woven branches plastered over. Expediencies inhibited the use of masonry either for chimneys or foundations. The dwellings of the likewise recreated Plymouth plantation in Massachusetts are equally makeshift structures, but their frames are covered with wood boards. Now, Virginia preserves no standing structures dating from the first half of the 17th century. As with the pit houses, archaeological investigations revealed that the earliest dwellings were not meant to be permanent structures. Their short-lived existence was bolstered by having their main structural posts driven directly into the ground. The square holes in this site are where evidence of the posts have been excavated. The brick area is the floor of a root cellar. The house had no masonry chimney. This drawing illustrates what such a house may have looked like. It displays the uncomplicated joinery developed in the mid-17th century Chesapeake region. Framing joints were kept as simple as possible. Many of the framing members were kept to the same general dimensions. The frame, including roof and sides, was sheathed with boards. It was not an impressive-looking structure, but an efficient one, and one that could be erected relatively easily and quickly. This simple framing system continued well into the next century, as shown in this diagram of a typical colonial Virginia dwelling of the 18th century. It was this type of framing, covered with board siding, that was employed for the Dudley Diggs house, but by then brick foundations and chimneys were standard. Now, many New England house rights were more conservative. They held on to framing methods used in post-medieval England. As we noted, good quality timber was becoming scarce in the Tudor period, particularly long timbers for framing members. Hence, roof structures in England were broken up into many gables, which could be constructed with shorter members. Walls employed a multiplicity of short timbers as well, as displayed in London's 16th century Staple Inn. This phenomenon is reflected in Salem's Witch House. Like Staple Inn, its roof framing forms several gables. We also note the projecting second floor, called a jetty, a defining feature of much Tudor period framing. It's often claimed that the jetty was just a means for getting extra floor area on the upper level, and it does provide a little extra space, as seen in these English Tudor houses. But remembering that long timbers were in short supply, Tudor houses were rarely framed with vertical posts the height of 2 stories. So, following suit in New England, rather than fasten one timber directly on top of another, it was easier to provide framing for the upper story using an elementary form of cantilever, resulting in the overhang or jetty. When New England house rights realized that they could obtain timbers in any length they wanted, including ones 2 stories in height, they sometimes referenced the jetty by cutting a molding on the posts at the top of the first floor level, and then eventually forgetting the jetty altogether. So it's often difficult to tell on some early New England houses whether a shallow jetty is real or false. This house in Guilford, Connecticut does have an actual frame jetty, but a very shallow one. Nevertheless, the jetty has become an endearing feature of colonial architecture, and is often seen in colonial revival New England style houses. This framing diagram in the Philadelphia Carpenter Company's rule book indicates that colonial carpenters eventually learned that obtaining framing posts extending 2 full stories or more was not an issue. Well, having discussed some aspects of colonial framing, we can now consider siding. As noted, the first settlers likely started off building with exposed framing, as was the tradition in the mother country. But they soon realized that we had an abundance of wood available for sheathing, and that subjecting exposed noggin to our more violent weather was not a good idea. However, before I launch into a discussion of siding, I want to add a footnote. Recognizing that quality timber was in short supply in Tudor England, builders of more humble dwellings had to make do with lower-grade wood. So after a century or more, some of these timbers had twisted and warped. Although picturesque, these distorted timbers opened up cracks in the noggin. By the 18th century, such warping had become a problem. To deal with it, builders frequently covered over both the framing and the noggin with ceramic tiles, often ones with decorative shapes. This practice is called tile hanging, seen on the upper story of this house. And notice the warping of the roof ridge here. Tile hanging attracted the notice of late 19th century builders and architects in America, where many late Victorian houses were often given a Tudor character. However, instead of using ceramic tiles, wood shingles were employed, often with decorative shapes. Notice, too, the Tudor-style framing in the gable. So the inspiration for many of our shingle-style houses is Tudor vernacular. Okay, back to siding. Wood shingle siding became a practice here for houses in storm-prone areas such as Long Island and Cape Cod, but not shingles with decorative shapes. We see plain shingles cladding the facade of the 18th century Customs House in Long Island's Sag Harbor. This modern Cape Cod-style house continues the regional tradition of shingle siding. In 17th century Virginia, siding consisted almost exclusively of clapboards, even for roofing. On such vernacular houses, framing members at the junction of wall and roof were often exposed. We see this practice in an early 18th century dwelling where the rafter and joist ends are visible. This did not make for efficient protection against weather or critter invasion. So as buildings got more sophisticated, these exposed members were sealed in with boards. And what do we have? Well, a classical cornice consisting of crown molding, fascia, soffit, and bed moldings, the essential ingredients of a simple Tuscan cornice. Such detailing was likely modeled after illustrations in the many builders' pattern books available in the 18th century. In Virginia and other mid-Atlantic colonies, the more refined timber-framed houses were sheathed with weatherboards, not clapboards. Weatherboard is the proper term for siding boards that are sawn, not split or ribbon, and are sawn from softwood such as pine or poplar. Using virgin timber, it was possible to make weatherboards up to 20 feet in length. Here we see a demonstration of sawing weatherboards, using a vertical saw. And since the bottom sawyer was sometimes positioned in a dugout pit, weatherboards are often referred to as pit sawn. In this image of weatherboard siding, we note the common practice of scribing and planing the bottom edge with a rounded bead. The beading provides a visual refinement, and it also inhibits splintering on the board's bottom edge. And notice, too, the use of a corner board, which also has a beaded edge. Notice as well the nail pattern indicating where the boards were nailed to the studs. Sometimes weatherboards were planed with a quarter-round molding on their bottom edges. They are termed molded weatherboards. Note how the molding is carried along the bottom of the windowsill here. And we see a bold display of molded weatherboards on Charleston's John Stewart House. Cypress was the preferred wood for South Carolina weatherboards. A more refined treatment for weatherboards consisted of molding or planing the bottom edge with a cyma curve, a subtle, elegant touch. The use of weatherboards is very rare in England, but we do find some early examples, especially in the southeast counties of Kent and Sussex, where they are a regional characteristic. A number of weatherboarded dwellings line the high street of Tenterden in Kent, and molded weatherboards sheathe the facades of these houses in the Sussex town of Rye. Now, many people mistakenly refer to weatherboards as clapboards. The terms should not be used interchangeably. More precisely, clapboards are boards that are split or riven from logs, rather than sawn, and are made from hardwood such as oak or chestnut, but also sometimes heart pine. They are generally only 40 to 48 inches in length, with just about 4 inches of exposure. This diagram in the lower left shows the short clapboards being riven from a log. With the introduction of steam-powered circular saws in the 1830s, clapboards could be sawn, but it leaves circular saw marks on their surface. Now, clapboards were the material of choice for the majority of New England houses. They were often applied over sheathing boards used for added insulation. If not whitewashed or painted, clapboards could give a house a somewhat coarse appearance. And clapboards were often mitered at corners rather than stopped with a corner board. This photo of a Salem house shows the joints between the clapboards, and also the clapboard's smaller scale, more in keeping with the smaller scale of New England houses. On more refined houses, clapboards were sometimes beaded, but could still have random lengths. Now, since both clapboards and weatherboards were cut from well-seasoned virgin timber, they can last indefinitely if properly maintained. In Virginia, Tuckahoe's molded weatherboards are nearly 300 years old. A striking but exceptionally rare treatment of colonial siding is the shaping of boards to resemble rustication or stone ashlar. The Vernon House in Newport, Rhode Island, is a demonstration of how a wooden dwelling could be transformed into a high-style Georgian mansion with the use of rusticated siding. Of course, our most famous example of wood rustication is Mount Vernon. George Washington refaced the mansion's exterior with wood rustication in the course of 2 enlargements, and the stone-like granular surface was produced by blowing fine sand into the wet paint. Wood rustication is sometimes found in England. This example is also in the Kent town of Tenterden. All right, we can now turn our attention to an essential feature of a work of architecture, the roof. A fundamental roof shape is the gable or A-frame, a form in use since prehistoric times. A primary function of a roof is to shed water. The gable's A shape does it effectively. The angle of gables varies. Looking again at the Diggs house here, we see that the angle is nearly 19 degrees. Anything greater is probably less efficient and not as structurally sound. Here, as in many colonial houses, the roof is penetrated by dormers, lighting living space within the roof structure. Now, the gable can be steeper for a house that's single pile or only 1 room deep. And gable edges are normally sealed with wood raking boards following the edges of the gable, which are also required for roofs on masonry structures. We see the raking boards on this brick house, and the gable wall is faced with an exterior-in chimney, which can be an effective design feature. In northern regions, especially Long Island and New England, 2-story gable roof houses frequently have a rear section called a lean-to, adding to the length of the gable's rear slope. We call this house form a salt box, because the lean-to shape resembles the antique boxes made for storing salt. An antique salt box is shown on the left. Another colonial roof form is the clipped gable. This consists of a gable roof with the ends of its ridge clipped to form a short hip, providing a softer profile, as seen on this colonial outbuilding. The form is not uncommon for high-style houses, such as the Shield House in Yorktown. Here the slope of the clipped gable is echoed in the hipped roofs of the dormers. A later but conspicuous use of the clipped gable is found on Kenmore, home of George Washington's sister, Betty Washington Lewis. The origin of the clipped gable can be traced to the thatched roofs of Tudor-period cottages. It was easier to make a thatch roof more watertight by framing the roof so that the thatch could wrap the gable end, and it normally was not done over the full gable so as to allow for a window in the gable end. Another common colonial roof form is the gambrel roof, which is a gable roof with two slopes on each side. The term comes from the word for the hock in an animal's leg. From that we also get the word gambol, which is the figure made by an animal's leaping. In this 17th century English house we see a gable roof broken with two slopes to make the gambrel. The gambrel roof is also associated with colonial houses built by Dutch settlers in New York State, and is frequently called a Dutch roof. For this reason we often refer to 20th century gambrel roof houses as Dutch colonial, although the form was not exclusively Dutch. So gambrel roofs are frequently found on colonial houses throughout New England built by settlers of English origin. The gambrel form was also prevalent in colonial Virginia. The gambrel shape had the advantage of providing extra volume in the rooms within the roof structure and voided the need to construct a full second story. Gambrel roofs in Virginia rarely date before the 1750s, and it's not unusual to find gable roof houses that have been altered to gambrel roof ones. This happened on this house called Wilton. If you look carefully, you can see the line of the original gable in the brickwork. Gambrel roofs were also popular for colonial revival houses, not only for their picturesque qualities, but because of their practical advantage. This 20th century Richmond house is a near copy of Wilton. Now, such houses were normally custom built, but you could also purchase published designs. The image in the left is an illustration for a design offered in the magazine House and Garden of 1938. We see the design realized on the right. A distinctive colonial roof form is the jerkin-head roof, or clipped gambrel. It consists of a gambrel roof with the ends of the upper slope framed for the clip or hip as on a regular clipped gable. The origin of the term jerkin-head is obscure, and it's often used to refer to a regular clipped gable roof. A famous example of a jerkin-head roof is on the Moore House in Yorktown, where, on October 17, 1781, the terms for the surrender of British forces were negotiated, thus ending the Revolutionary War, and, shall we say, the colonial period. 20th century colonial revival builders and architects sometimes made use of the jerkin-head roof, as seen on this brick version of the Moore House. Now, the roof form usually reserved for more refined colonial houses is the hipped roof. A hipped roof slopes on all four sides and meets at a ridge. During the 18th century, the form was often referred to as an Italian roof. It was popularized by Andrea Palladio's designs for Italian villas, published in his 1570 treatise, Quattro Libri, or the Four Books on Architecture. Typical is his design for the Villa Sarceno. Here the length of the ridge is 1/4 the width of the facade. On Williamsburg's George Wythe House, the ridge is somewhat longer, but there's no hard and fast rule about the exact proportions of a hip roof. It depends on the angle of the hips. On a single pile house, or a house just one room deep, the ridge can be considerably longer. A hipped roof can also be quite steep, as on Westover, if it incorporates an attic story with dormers. Now, a variation on the hip roof is the hip-on-hip roof, as employed on Blandfield, a 1770s Virginia mansion. The extra hip was a device for visually breaking the otherwise large mass of a hipped roof when the house is very deep, or nearly square in plan, or when there is no attic story with dormers, as with Westover. A version of the hip-on-hip roof is seen on Drayton Hall. The steep angle and concave shape of the lower hip, contrasting with the shallow hip above, is more akin to the mansard roofs of 17th century high-style buildings in France, such as the Chateau de Dampierre. Drayton's roof form may have resulted from the influence of Huguenot artisans and builders who settled in South Carolina after being expelled from France by Louis XIV. Popular in northern colonies was the deck-on-hip roof. Instead of coming to a peak or ridge, the roof was framed to create a flattened area or deck topping the dwelling. The deck could be treated as an architectural feature as seen on the Longfellow House, or could be more prosaic on a neighboring Cambridge residence. Such decks are sometimes called widows' walks, because it was said that in seaport towns it was where wives of seamen watched for the return of their spouses, often to be disappointed. However, the deck more often served the practical function of allowing quick access to the roof for extinguishing blazes set by embers from chimney fires. Such rooftop access could also be applied to a gambrel roof, as seen on the Ropes House in Salem. And as we see on an 18th century drawing of Westover, how at one time a roof access had been rigged up surrounding the mansion's hip roof. Colonial wood shingle roofs were constantly vulnerable to fires from the regular burning fireplaces. Well, before we leave roof forms, I might mention a common treatment of colonial roof cornices, and that is the application of modillions. Modillions are a standard classical motif, symbolizing the ends of timbers in ancient wooden construction. They are decorative. They serve no structural function. They're just nailed on these wooden houses. Here we see simple plain modillions, probably copied from one of the many pattern books used by colonial builders. We see similar plain modillions illustrated in Batty Langley's The Builder's Director. And note that Langley describes the order as, quote, Tuscan capital and entablature from the ancients, unquote. Well, we can now consider roofing materials common to colonial dwellings. Archaeological investigations of early 17th century sites in Jamestown have unearthed numerous fragments of clay roofing tiles. Clay or ceramic tile roofs are widespread in England, as seen on Mompesson House, a famous early 18th century mansion in Salisbury. Here, flat tiles are used. Another tile form seen in England is pantiles, which consists of interlocking S-shaped tiles. We have an early pantile roof in Charleston, South Carolina, but surviving examples are rare. The New World's endless timber resource soon made wood the primary material for the majority of colonial roofs. Clay tiles were quickly forgotten. Clapboard roofs were sometimes used on simple vernacular structures, but they're not as efficient as wood shingles. Wood shingles, sometimes called shakes, became the preferred roofing material for nearly all 18th century buildings in Virginia and most other colonies. Using seasoned old-growth wood such as pine, cedar, cypress, oak, or chestnut, a well-maintained shingle roof could last well over 50 years. Seen in this demonstration roof, the shingles have random widths. Shingles could have their bottom edges trimmed straight, or more often than not, their corners were rounded, which inhibited the shingles from curling or warping and gave the roof visual character. A rare example of a section of mid-18th century wood shingles with barely 10 years of exposure, is preserved under a later addition on Lansdowne, a colonial Virginia mansion. Here the shingles are a full inch thick and retain traces of red paint applied as a preservative. A common treatment for the ridge of a wood shingle roof, particularly in the mid-Atlantic region, was combing. That is, alternating the overlap of the ends of the shingles at the ridge to create a zigzag path in profile, forming a waterproof seal. Also, the top shingles was extended several inches above the ridge on the north slope to protect the ridge from the prevailing north storms. Projecting ridge shingles are seen on this traditional wood shingle roof. The ridge in most of the northern colonies was customarily capped with a row of overlapping horizontally laid shingles. A properly fabricated traditional wood shingle roof is a work of fine craftsmanship. In this newly installed roof on a mid-18th century house, we see how the shingles are fanned around the ridges of the dormers, and the use of what are called swept valleys, where the dormers join the main roof, providing a gently curved junction. Numerous roofing companies offer products of modern material resembling historic wood shingles. A well-known type is Hendrix tile, a shingle composed of cementous material providing durability as well as fireproofing. We see a Hendrix tile roof on a colonial Williamsburg structure with several decades of weathering. And the tiles have acquired a silvery patina resembling aged wood shingles. With the numerous slate quarries in this country opening in the early 19th century, many wood shingle roofs were replaced with slate. The slate roof on Westover replaced a wood shingle roof in the 1840s and is still serving efficiently. Note the gradation of the slates. That is, how they diminish in size as they extend to the ridge, a common refinement of slate roofs. For many colonial revival houses, built from the 1920s through the 1950s, slate was the preferred roofing material, both for its durability and its aesthetic qualities. However, its expense has made it less popular today, causing a shift to synthetic slate. All right, we will now consider windows, an all-important, character-defining feature of colonial architecture. Archaeological investigations of early 17th century sites have sometimes unearthed fragments of Tudor or Jacobean-style lead casement windows, but such artifacts are rare in the extreme since only the tiniest fraction of 17th century buildings had glass windows. Examination of window frames on some extant late 17th and early 18th century houses indicate that they were originally fitted with lead casements. The Lynnhaven house shown here had its lead casement windows reproduced when the house was restored some 30 years ago. Lead casement windows are fragile and inefficient. On hot summers, the heat can soften the lead cames and cause the sash to sag. As a result, during the mid-18th century, virtually all early lead casement windows were replaced with sliding sash windows, either single or double hung. Indeed, this country has no original lead casement windows surviving in situ. Yet lead casement windows are admired for their quaint character and were often made a feature of 20th century Tudor revival houses. The development of double-hung sash windows, primarily in England in the late 17th century, was a welcome introduction and made sliding sash the window of choice from that time to the present. An abundant display of this new type window distinguishes the wings of Hampton Court Palace, designed by Sir Christopher Wren for King William and Queen Mary. The larger, more expensive glass panes were reserved for the stateroom windows. The earliest recorded use of sash windows in Virginia was for the Wren Building at the College of William and Mary, begun in 1695. The building was gutted by fire in 1705. It was rebuilt within its brick walls. We see its second set of colonial sash windows in a photograph dating prior to 1859, when the building burned a second time. Colonial period window sash is rare, so we're fortunate to have for study the surviving original sash in Carter's Grove, a 1750s plantation house near Williamsburg. The photograph shows a standard pattern of 9 panes in each sash. We see the glass panes secured by thick muttons or glazing bars. Because all window glass in the colonial period was imported and therefore costly and subject to breakage, the panes were held securely with thick muttons. In this chart, we see a variety of mutton profiles and thicknesses used from the 1720s to the 1820s and getting progressively thinner as the quality of window glass improved and became more affordable. Looking again at Carter's Grove, we note that the window frame meeting rails are thinner than the rest of the frame, which is partially hidden by the tracks into which the sashes are fit. The goal was to make the meeting rail read having the same thickness as a mutton to keep a consistent pattern of muttons throughout. This is a refinement detail often overlooked in the restoration of colonial period houses or the design of colonial revival ones. This happened in Gunston Hall, where its sash windows were installed in a 1950s restoration. Here the sash frames were made equal width on all 4 sides. This resulted in the meeting rails being too thick and causing the sash to be not historically correct nor aesthetically pleasing. In New England, colonial windows tended to be wider and fitted with smaller panes. The sashes are often 4 panes wide. The Lee Nichols house in Cambridge has 8/12 sashes on its 2 principal floors. The wider openings allowed for more light and solar heat gain in the colder New England climate, especially in winter with its shorter daylight hours. Also, the smaller glass panes are more in keeping with the smaller scale of New England houses. As for the exterior window frames, some of the more sophisticated colonial houses followed the rule for determining the frame's width as stated by James Gibbs in his 1732 treatise, Rules for Drawing the Several Parts of Architecture. Gibbs writes that the width of the frame or architrave surround should be 1/6 the width of the opening, excluding the sash. We see this rule being followed in the Wythe House windows. The architrave frame is 1/6 the width of the opening. This rule was cast aside in London with the Window Frame Act of 1774, which required the frame to be built into the thickness of the wall. The elimination of as much exterior wood as possible was for fire protection, a big issue in London. Though the rule was not mandated in this country, the practice was carried out during the federal period and later. Latrobe's Decatur House in Washington follows this fashion. And since Latrobe was a native Englishman and trained in England, he would have been quite familiar with this practice. Before ending part 1 of this discussion, I have a final word about windows. Looking again at the Wythe House, we see a treatment called diminution of fenestration, which is just a fancy way of saying that the second floor windows are slightly smaller in height and width than the first floor windows. This is a sophisticated refinement to prevent the house from looking top-heavy and to avoid an optical illusion. The optical illusion is created when the first and second floor windows are the same size. We see this in Pembroke, a house similar to the Wythe House and about the same age. Its second-story windows are exactly the same size as the first-floor windows, but they appear larger, an optical illusion. More often than not, in high-style colonial houses, the second-floor windows are the same width as the first-floor ones, but not as tall. We see this effect in Yorktown's Nelson House. The shorter height of the second-floor windows requires the panes to be slightly smaller than the first-floor window panes. The second-floor panes here are square. The first-floor ones are slightly taller. Interestingly, the diminution of second-floor window sizes is rarely seen in New England houses, even high-style ones. More often than not, first and second-floor windows are the same size. Well, this discussion of windows brings us to the end of Part 1 of this presentation on colonial architecture. In Part 2, we will begin with a brief look at proportional systems employed in colonial design. But the larger part of the second session will be devoted to interior features and details. So, enjoy a break and then join me for the second half of the class. Thank you.